Millionaire sees woman picking food from trash and couldn't believe her attitude. Subscribe for more touching stories. Richard Montgomery walked along the cobblestone streets of Santa Fe in his impeccable Italian suit, absent-mindedly checking messages on his latest smartphone. The afternoon sun tinged the colonial facades with golden hues, creating a stark contrast with his imposing figure as a successful businessman. At 45, he was the CEO of Montgomery Developments, one of the largest real estate companies in North America. That afternoon, after a particularly frustrating meeting with local investors who resisted his plans to build a new luxury complex in the historic district, Richard decided to do something unusual: walk back to his hotel. Contrary to his habit of always using his armored Mercedes for transportation, it was then that his eyes caught a scene that completely clashed with the city's tourist scenery. A young woman, approximately 35 years old, discreetly rummaging through a trash container near a famous restaurant. Her movements were delicate, almost embarrassed, as if trying to become invisible to the eyes of passers-by. Something about that scene deeply disturbed him. Perhaps it was the woman's simple but clean clothes, or the dignity with which she conducted that act of desperation. For a moment, Richard thought about going on his way, as he always did when faced with the poverty he tried so hard to ignore. But there was something familiar about that woman, something that prevented him from looking away. Contrary to all his usual instincts, Richard began to discreetly follow her. The woman, carrying a small bag, walked through increasingly narrow and less touristy alleys until she reached a peripheral neighborhood where colorful houses gave way to unfinished constructions and dirt roads. That's when she stopped in front of a small two-room house with peeling walls and a wooden door worn by time. Two children, who appeared to be between 10 and 12 years old, ran to hug her. The older boy had features that vaguely reminded Richard of someone he knew, but he couldn't pinpoint who. "Mom, did you get anything?" asked the younger boy with hopeful eyes. "Yes, my love. Today we're going to make a very tasty soup," she replied, with a smile that contrasted with the tiredness in her eyes. It was at that moment that Richard felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time: compassion. He observed how the woman, even in her precarious situation, maintained an admirable dignity. The children, despite their simple clothes, were clean and well cared for. As he watched the scene, a sudden flashback hit him. That face. It couldn't be Helen. The same Helen he had met on one of his business trips to Santa Fe about 13 years ago. The brief romance they had was intense, but he left without leaving contact, continuing his life of business conquests and superficial relationships. Richard felt his legs weaken. The features of the older boy, which had intrigued him so much, now made sense. They were his own features as a child, the same ones he saw in old family photos. At that moment, his phone rang shrilly, breaking the silence of the alley. Helen turned abruptly, her eyes widening as she recognized him. The children, curious, looked in the direction of the well-dressed stranger observing their house. "Richard!" Helen's voice came out as a whisper, mixing surprise and apprehension. The businessman, for the first time in many years, didn't know how to react. His world of business, contracts, and luxury seemed to crumble before that scene. The words got stuck in his throat as a devastating certainty formed in his mind. Those children, with their curious eyes and innocent expressions, carried his blood. The sun was starting to set in Santa Fe, painting the sky in orange hues, as Richard Montgomery, the powerful real estate mogul, faced the biggest turnaround of his life. There, in that simple alley, his past and present met unexpectedly, preparing the ground for a transformation that would change not only his life, but that of many other people. The silence that followed their mutual recognition seemed to last an eternity. Helen, recovering from the initial shock, turned to the children with a forced smile. "Michael, Peter, go inside and start washing the vegetables for the soup, please." The children, sensing the tension in the air, reluctantly obeyed, casting curious glances at the elegant stranger who remained motionless on the street. As soon as they entered, Helen crossed her arms, a defensive posture that Richard immediately recognized. 13 years, Richard. 13 years without a single word from you," she said, her voice controlled but laden with contained emotion. "What are you doing here?" Richard adjusted his tie, an automatic gesture he always made when feeling uncomfortable. I didn't know, Helen. I swear I didn't know. His words sounded hollow even to himself. You didn't know, because you didn't want to know, she replied bitterly. I tried to find you when I discovered I was pregnant. Your secretaries always said you were in a meeting or traveling or simply too busy. The businessman felt the weight of each word like a blow. He vaguely remembered his assistant mentioning years ago that a woman from Santa Fe insisted on speaking with him. At the time, busy with expanding his business, he had ordered those inconvenient calls to be blocked. Are they twins? He asked, his voice betraying his emotion. Helen nodded. Michael was born first, Peter came 5 minutes later. They're identical in appearance, but so different in personality. She stopped as if realizing she was sharing too much information. From inside the house came the sound of children talking and running water. The simplicity of the environment contrasted drastically with the luxurious settings Richard frequented. Why are you here now, Richard? What do you want? The question caught him off guard. What did he want after all? A few hours ago, his biggest concern was closing $1 million deal. Now he discovered he was the father of 2 boys living in precarious conditions. I want to help, he finally said. Let me do something for you. Helen laughed, a joyless sound. Now? After all this time? We managed to survive until now without your help, Richard. We don't need your charity. It's not charity, Helen, it's my responsibility. Those boys are my children. They deserve more than this. More than this? Helen raised her voice before controlling herself again. They have everything they need: love, education, values. They didn't grow up in mansions or attend expensive schools, but they're happy and honest. Richard took a step forward, but Helen instinctively backed away. I have an empty apartment downtown close to the best schools. I can transfer you there immediately. No, Helen interrupted him. You can't just show up after 13 years and think money solves everything. You don't know your children, Richard. You don't know that Michael dreams of being an artist, that Peter loves mathematics. You weren't there when they had chickenpox, when they took their first steps, when... Her voice faltered, and Richard saw tears in her eyes. At that moment, Michael appeared at the door. Mum, is everything okay? Helen quickly wiped her eyes. Yes, dear. I'll be right in. Richard looked at the boy, his son, and saw his own features reflected there. The same eyes, the same face shape. How had he not noticed before? Please, Helen, he said, lowering his voice. I'm not trying to buy anything. I just want a chance to do the right thing, even if it's too late. Helen was silent for a long moment, observing the man she had once loved and who was now practically a stranger. Come back tomorrow, she finally said. We'll talk after the children go to school. But I promise nothing, Richard, and I don't want them to know who you are, not yet. Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. As he walked away down the darkening alley, he heard the boys' animated voices calling for their mother, asking about dinner. His children. The word echoed in his mind like a bell, awakening feelings he didn't even know he possessed. On his way back to the luxurious hotel, Richard Montgomery, the man who had built an empire based on numbers and contracts, for the first time in his adult life, cried. The next morning, Richard woke up before the alarm, his mind still processing the events of the previous day. The luxurious hotel room, which had always been his refuge, now seemed cold and impersonal. He dressed mechanically, opting for more casual clothes, a conscious decision not to intimidate Helen and the children. He arrived at the simple neighborhood shortly after 8, observing from afar as Helen said goodbye to the boys at the school gate. His heart raced as he watched Michael and Peter running to join their classmates, their worn backpacks bouncing on their small backs. When the children disappeared inside the school building, Richard approached. Helen saw him and nodded silently, guiding him back to the modest house. Come in, she said, opening the door. It's not what you're used to, but it's our home. Richard entered, observing every detail. The walls, although peeling, were decorated with colorful drawings. Michael's work, he guessed. A small shelf housed used books and some math trophies, certainly Peter's. They're talented, he commented, indicating the drawings and trophies. Helen smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Richard had seen since their reunion. They are. Michael has a gift for art, and Peter, well, he solves equations like he's playing a video game. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Richard cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. Helen, I want to apologize. I know it's not enough, but it's a start. I was selfish, irresponsible. I never imagined that your actions would have consequences, Helen completed, her tone a mixture of bitterness and resignation. Richard, I'm not interested in your apologies. I want to know what you intend to do now. Richard took a deep breath. I want to be part of their lives. I know I don't have the right to demand this, but I'm asking for a chance. Let me get to know them, help financially, be a father. Helen interrupted him. Being a father is not just giving money or showing up occasionally with expensive gifts. It's being present every day, facing difficulties, teaching values. I know, Richard replied, surprising himself with the humility in his voice, and I'm willing to learn. I don't just want to give money, Helen. I want to be a real part of their lives, and yours if you'll let me. Helen studied him for a long moment as if trying to assess his sincerity. And how do you intend to do that? Your life is in New York, isn't it? Meetings, trips, social events. It was then that Richard realized he hadn't yet thought about the practical implications of his decision. His business empire, built over years, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the challenge of being a father. I can move here, he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. I can manage the company remotely, delegate more responsibilities. The important thing is to be here. Helen raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You would do that? Abandon your life of luxury for this? She gestured around, indicating the simplicity of the house. Richard looked around again, but this time with different eyes. He saw the children's growth marks scribbled on a doorframe, photos of past birthdays, a calendar full of notes about school activities and doctor's appointments. This house, despite its simplicity, was full of love and memories. Things his mansion in New York never had. Yes, he answered, with a certainty that surprised him. I would do that and much more. At that moment, Helen's gaze softened a little. Richard, I appreciate your willingness, but we can't just turn the children's lives upside down. They don't know who you are, and revealing that suddenly could be traumatic. Richard nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. You're right, how can we do this? Helen thought for a moment. Maybe we can start slowly. You could be introduced as a family friend first. Spend some time with them without pressure. If everything goes well, over time we can tell the truth. Helen's proposal was sensible, and Richard felt a wave of gratitude for her careful approach. I completely agree. I'll do it your way, Helen. At your pace. As they discussed the practical details of this arrangement, Richard felt a change happening within him. The concerns with business and profits that previously dominated his thoughts now seemed distant and unimportant. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about the future not in terms of acquisitions and mergers, but of smiles, hugs, and shared moments. As he left Helen's house that morning, Richard Montgomery was a transformed man. The powerful real estate tycoon was giving way to something new, a father eager to know and love his children, a man rediscovering the meaning of family and purpose. As he walked back to the hotel, his phone rang incessantly with calls from executives and business partners. For the first time, Richard ignored them all. He had much more important matters to resolve, like finding a suitable apartment in Santa Fe and planning his first casual visit to the family he barely knew, but already loved deeply. In the weeks that followed, Richard immersed himself in a new routine that contrasted drastically with his previous life. He rented a modest apartment in downtown Santa Fe, close enough to be present, but not so close as to suffocate Helen and the children. His first official visit as a family friend was carefully orchestrated. Helen introduced him as an old acquaintance who was passing through the city. Michael and Peter, initially shy, soon warmed up to the presence of the new Uncle Richard. Do you like ice cream? Richard asked, feeling strangely nervous. The boys' eyes sparkled. Yes, they answered in unison. How about we all go to the ice cream parlor after dinner? He suggested, looking at Helen for approval. Helen nodded with a slight smile. If you finish your homework first. That first ice cream outing became a weekly ritual. Richard listened attentively as Michael talked about his drawings, and Peter enthusiastically explained the math problems he was solving at school. Every word, every gesture from the boys was precious to him. At work, Richard began to delegate more responsibilities, surprising his executives with his sudden change in priorities. Video conferences replaced business trips, and he began to decline invitations to social events he once considered unmissable. One day, during one of his visits, Peter surprised him with a question. "Uncle Richard, why don't you build houses for people like us instead of huge buildings?" The question caught him off guard. Richard realized he had never really considered the social impact of his developments. "You know, Peter, that's an excellent question," he replied thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time to rethink some things in my work." This innocent conversation planted a seed in Richard's mind. He began to research social housing and sustainable urban development, areas he had completely ignored before. Meanwhile, his relationship with Helen was slowly evolving. The barriers she had erected began to gradually dissipate. One night, after the children went to bed, they sat talking on the small porch of the house. "You've changed, Richard," said Helen, observing him with curiosity. "I think I'm finally becoming the person I always should have been," he replied sincerely. Helen smiled, a gesture that made Richard's heart race. "The children adore you. Michael even asked the other day why you don't come live with us." Richard swallowed hard. "And what did you answer?" "That things are complicated for adults," she said, her gaze lost in the starry night of Santa Fe. At that moment, Richard felt an urge to tell everything to the children, to hug them and say he was their father. But he respected the process Helen had established. Weeks turned into months. Richard became a constant presence in the family's life. He helped with homework, attended school presentations, and even learned to cook some simple dishes to surprise everyone on weekends. At work, his new ideas began to take shape. He presented to the company board a pilot project for affordable housing, arguing that this would not only be beneficial for society, but would also open new markets for the construction company. "Gentlemen," he said during a tense board meeting, "our company has the opportunity to be a pioneer in a new business model, one that combines profit with social responsibility." Some board members were skeptical, others intrigued. Richard realized he had a fight ahead, but he was determined. The simple but meaningful life he was experiencing in Santa Fe had changed his perspective on what really mattered. One night, after a particularly joyful dinner with Helen and the children, Richard decided it was time for a serious conversation. When the boys went to bed, he turned to Helen. "I think it's time we tell them the truth," he said nervously. Helen studied him for a long moment before responding. "You're right. They deserve to know, but Richard, are you sure? This will change everything." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of the decision. "I'm sure. I want to be their father in every sense, not just a cool uncle who shows up from time to time." They agreed to tell the children the following weekend. As Richard returned to his apartment that night, he felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. His life had changed dramatically in recent months and was about to change even more. Looking at the city lights, Richard Montgomery, once a real estate shark, now a man rediscovering the meaning of family and purpose, felt truly at peace with his choices for the first time in many years. The path ahead would be challenging, full of obstacles both personal and professional, but Richard was ready to face them, strengthened by the newfound love for his children and the chance to redeem himself in Helen's eyes. The long-awaited weekend arrived, bringing with it a mixture of anxiety and hope. Richard arrived early at Helen's house carrying a picnic basket. The idea was to create a relaxed environment for the conversation that would change their lives forever. "Ready for our adventure?" Richard asked the boys, who were bouncing with excitement. Michael and Peter ran to the car while Helen exchanged a significant look with Richard. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "More than ever," he replied, his voice firm but gentle. The group drove to a park in the hills surrounding Santa Fe. The location, with its panoramic view of the colorful city, seemed the perfect setting for a new beginning. While the children played nearby, Helen and Richard spread out the picnic blanket and arranged the food. The moment of truth was approaching, and both could feel the tension growing. "Michael, Peter, come here for a moment," Helen called. "We have something important to talk to you about." The boys approached, curious. Richard felt his heart racing. "Remember when you asked about your father?" Helen began, her voice soft. The twins nodded, exchanging confused looks. "Well," Helen continued, taking a deep breath, "it turns out that Uncle Richard isn't just a family friend. He's your father." A heavy silence fell over the group. Michael was the first to react, his eyes widening in understanding. Peter, on the other hand, frowned, clearly processing the information. "But," "Why didn't you tell us before?" Michael asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and hurt. Richard felt a lump in his throat. I made a lot of mistakes in the past, Michael. I didn't know about you, and when I found out, well, your mother and I thought it was better to get to know each other first, before telling you everything." Peter, always the more analytical one, asked, "So, all these visits, the ice cream, the help with homework, it was all to get closer to us?" "Yes and no," Richard replied, carefully choosing his words. "I wanted to get to know you, to be part of your lives. But every moment we spent together was genuine. I learned to love you in a way I never imagined I could love anyone." The boys' reactions were distinct. Michael, the sensitive artist, had tears in his eyes, a mixture of conflicting emotions on his face. Peter, on the other hand, maintained a thoughtful expression, as if solving a complex math problem. "You have every right to be confused or even angry," said Helen, hugging her sons. "We know it's a lot to process." Richard knelt in front of the boys, his eyes level with theirs. "I want you to know that no matter what happens, I love you. And I'm here now, willing to be the father you deserve if you give me that chance." Michael was the first to react, throwing himself into Richard's arms with a sob. Peter hesitated for a moment before joining the hug, his small hands firmly grasping his father's shirt. The rest of the afternoon was spent on an emotional roller coaster. There were tears, nervous laughter, many questions, and gradually the tension began to dissipate. Richard told about his life, honestly answering the boys' curious questions about his business and why he lived in a different city. As the sun began to set, painting Santa Fe's sky with shades of orange and pink, the small family gathered their belongings. On the way back home, the car was quiet, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people processing a big change, full of possibilities. When they arrived at Helen's house, Richard hesitated before saying goodbye. Can I come tomorrow to talk more?" he asked, uncertain. It was Peter who answered, surprising everyone. "You can stay for dinner today if you want." "Dad." The word Dad came out hesitantly, almost a whisper, but to Richard it was like music. With tears in his eyes, he nodded, unable to speak. That night, as he helped Helen wash the dishes after a simple but meaningful dinner, Richard realized that his life had irrevocably changed. The man who once cared only about profits and status now found his greatest joy in simple moments like this. "What happens now?" Helen asked softly when the children had finally gone to bed. Richard looked out the kitchen window, at the city lights twinkling in the night. "Now," he said, "we build a family, and maybe something bigger." He shared with Helen his ideas about changing the focus of his company, about creating housing projects that would really make a difference in people's lives. Helen studied him for a long moment. "You really have changed, haven't you?" Richard smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his eyes. "Thanks to you. You've given me a purpose I didn't even know I was looking for." As they said goodbye at the door, there was a new understanding between them. The future was uncertain, full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, both Helen and Richard felt they were on the right path. Richard walked back to his apartment that night, his heart light despite the complexities that awaited him. He knew he would have to balance his new family life with the demands of his transforming company. But now, with the love of his children and the chance for a new beginning with Helen, he felt capable of facing any challenge. The businessman who arrived in Santa Fe months ago, concerned only with business, had disappeared. In his place was a transformed man, eager to make a difference not only in the life of his newly discovered family, but in the world around him. The following months brought a series of changes and challenges for Richard and his newly formed family. The transition wasn't easy, but each obstacle overcome united them even more. Richard decided to move permanently to Santa Fe, renting a house spacious enough to accommodate everyone comfortably, but without the opulence that had marked his previous life. Helen, initially hesitant, ended up agreeing to live together, recognizing that it would be better for the children. Adapting to the new family dynamic brought moments of joy and tension. Michael, the more emotional of the twins, alternated between periods of deep connection with Richard and moments of resentment for his past absence. Peter, on the other hand, seemed to accept the situation more easily, fascinated by his father's business stories and eager to learn more. One night, after helping Peter with a particularly challenging math project, Richard found Michael alone on the porch, drawing. "May I see?" Richard asked gently. Michael hesitated before showing the drawing. It was a portrait of the family, including Richard, but he was drawn a little apart from the others. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "Is that how you see me, son?" Michael shrugged, avoiding his father's gaze. "Sometimes, and I feel like you're still not completely part of it." Richard sat down next to his son, carefully choosing his words. "Michael, I know I can't change the past, but I promise I'm here now and always will be. Would you give me a chance to get closer in your drawing?" With a small smile, Michael picked up the pencil and began to redraw Richard's figure, this time at the center of the family. Meanwhile, in the business world, Richard faced resistance to his new vision for the company. Many shareholders and board members saw his social housing plans as an unnecessary risk. During a tense video conference, one of the oldest directors expressed his concern. "Richard, we understand your recent enthusiasm for social causes, but our responsibility is to the shareholders. These low-cost projects can hurt our profit margin." Richard took a deep breath before responding. "Our responsibility goes beyond the shareholders. We have the power to make a real difference in people's lives. Imagine the positive impact we can have, not just on financial statements, but on society as a whole." He presented a detailed plan showing how social housing projects could actually open new markets and improve the company's reputation in the long term. After hours of heated debate, Richard gained the necessary support to start a pilot project in Santa Fe. It was a modest start, but significant. Excited about the prospect, Richard shared the news with Helen and the children during dinner. "Does this mean we're going to build houses for people who need them like we used to?" asked Peter, his eyes shining with curiosity. Richard nodded, touched by his son's insight. "Exactly, Peter. We want to help families have a safe and dignified home." Helen, who until then had remained skeptical about Richard's ambitions, smiled approvingly. "It's a beautiful project, Richard. The children can learn a lot from this." Inspired, Richard had an idea. "How about you help me design some of the houses? Michael can create the designs, and Peter can help me with the cost calculations." The boys were excited about the idea, and soon the dining table was transformed into an impromptu office with drawings and numbers scattered everywhere. Observing the scene, Helen approached Richard. "You really have changed," she said softly. "I never imagined that the man I met years ago would become this." Richard gently took her hand. "You transformed me, Helen. You showed me what really matters in life." In the days that followed, Richard dove headfirst into the pilot project. He visited underprivileged communities, listened to stories of families struggling for a place to call home, and worked tirelessly to make the dream of decent and affordable housing a reality. The children, excited about their involvement in the project, began to share the initiative at school. Soon, the small community of Santa Fe was buzzing with news of Richard Montgomery's ambitious plan. However, not everything was rosy. As the project gained visibility, Richard began to face opposition from some local businessmen who feared that the new housing could devalue their properties. One night, returning late from a particularly tense meeting, Richard found Helen awake waiting for him. "You look exhausted," she said, concerned. Richard let himself fall on the couch. "It's harder than I imagined. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing." Helen sat down beside him. "Richard, look at me. What you're doing is important. Not just for these families, but for our children. You're showing them that it's possible to use the power and resources we have to do good." Her words rekindled Richard's determination. He realized that he wasn't just building houses or reshaping his company. He was building a legacy for his children, showing them the value of compassion and social responsibility. That night, lying in bed and listening to Helen's soft breathing beside him, Richard reflected on the incredible journey his life had become. From a businessman focused only on profits, he had transformed into a man determined to make a difference in the world, guided by the love of his family. The path ahead would be challenging, he knew that. But with Helen and the children by his side, Richard felt ready to face any obstacle. The dream of creating a better world, one house at a time, was just beginning. As the sun set over Santa Fe, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Richard looked at his family and at the houses under construction in the distance. He felt a wave of renewed determination. The dream of creating a positive impact in the world one house at a time, was more alive than ever. The following months brought a roller coaster of emotions and challenges for Richard and his family. The social housing project in Santa Fe continued to advance, but not without significant obstacles. The pressure from shareholders in New York reached a critical point. An extraordinary board meeting was called to decide the future of the company and Richard's permanence as CEO. The news fell like a bomb on the Montgomery family. On the night before the crucial video conference, Richard gathered Helen and the children in the living room. "Tomorrow I may lose my position in the company," he said, with a calmness that surprised even himself. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm at peace with my decisions." Helen squeezed his hand in silent support, while Michael and Peter exchanged worried looks. "But Dad," Peter protested, "what will happen to the project, to all those families counting on us?" Richard smiled, touched by his son's concern. "Don't worry, Peter. Even if I'm no longer in charge of the company, we'll find a way to continue our work here." Michael, who had been quiet, suddenly stood up. "I have an idea," he exclaimed, running to his room. He returned moments later with a stack of drawings. "What if we showed them? The stories of the people we're helping?" Michael's suggestion lit up Richard's eyes. Throughout the night, the family worked together, compiling stories, photos, and data that showed the real impact of the project on people's lives. The next morning, Richard entered the video conference with renewed confidence. Instead of defending himself with numbers and financial projections, he began by sharing the stories and images he had prepared with his family. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Richard said, his voice firm and passionate, "what you're seeing are not just houses or numbers on a spreadsheet. These are dreams realized, families strengthened, communities transformed." He showed the video of a young mother, tears in her eyes, receiving the keys to her new home. He shared the story of an elderly man who, for the first time in his life, had a place he could call his own. "Our project isn't just building houses," Richard continued. "It's building hope, dignity, and a better future. And believe me, this not only transforms lives but also creates a new market, a new customer base that will be loyal to our brand for generations." As Richard spoke, he noticed a subtle change in the expressions of the board members. The initial skepticism gave way to growing curiosity. When he finished his presentation, a tense silence took over the virtual room. Then, to everyone's surprise, the most conservative member of the board spoke. "Richard, I confess I came to this meeting ready to vote against you. But what I saw today, well, that changes everything. Perhaps we're on the threshold of something truly revolutionary for our industry." One by one, the board members expressed their renewed support for the project. By the end of the meeting, not only had Richard maintained his position as CEO, but he also received approval to expand the social housing program to other cities. When the video conference ended, Richard found his family anxiously waiting outside the office. "So?" Helen asked, concern evident in her voice. With a broad smile, Richard opened his arms. "We did it!" The celebration that followed was a mixture of laughter, tears, and tight hugs. Michael and Peter jumped for joy, while Helen looked at Richard with a mixture of pride and love. That night, the Montgomery family organized a small thank you event for the community that had supported them. In the courtyard of one of the newly built houses, local residents, project workers, and volunteers gathered to share food, music, and stories. Richard, standing amidst the crowd, felt a wave of emotion as he saw the tangible impact of his actions. Children played in a safe space, elderly people chatted on comfortable porches, and young couples planned their future with renewed hope. Helen approached, intertwining her fingers with his. "Look at what we've built together," she said softly. Richard nodded, moved, and this is just the beginning. As the sun set over Santa Fe, painting the sky with vibrant hues, Richard reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. From a businessman focused only on profits, he had transformed into an agent of change, guided by the love of his family and the desire to make a difference. The path ahead would still be challenging, he knew that. Expanding the project to other cities would bring new obstacles and resistance. But now, with the support of his family, his company, and an entire community, Richard felt ready to face any challenge. As night fell and the lights of the new houses lit up one by one, Richard was certain that he was on the right path. The dream of creating a positive impact in the world, one house at a time, was no longer just a dream. It was a growing reality, illuminating the future of countless families. Richard Montgomery, now 50 years old, observed the city from the terrace of his office in New York. The view was no longer dominated only by luxurious skyscrapers, but also by planned and sustainable communities that proudly rose among the traditional neighborhoods. A gentle touch on his shoulder pulled him from his reverie. It was Helen, who had become not only his life partner, but also a key figure in the expansion of the Homes for All project. "Ready for the big reveal?" she asked, a warm smile on her face. Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Today was the day Montgomery Developments would officially announce its transformation into a B Corp, legally committed to balancing purpose and profit. Together they went down to the packed auditorium, where journalists, investors, and community representatives from across the country eagerly awaited. On stage, Richard saw his children, now young adults, preparing to participate in the announcement. Michael, at 18, had become a talented social architect, incorporating local art and culture into each housing project. Peter, in turn, was studying sustainable economics and was already considered a prodigy in social finance. When Richard took the stage, a wave of applause filled the room. He raised his hands, asking for silence, and began his speech. "5 years ago, I embarked on a journey that many considered madness. I abandoned the blind pursuit of profit to chase a dream, to provide decent and accessible housing for all. Today I'm here to say that this dream is not only possible, but is the future of our industry." He paused, looking at his family with pride before continuing. "Montgomery Developments is no longer just a construction company. We are a force for social transformation. Every house we build, every community we plan, is a step towards a more just and sustainable world." Richard then invited Michael and Peter to the stage. The young men presented the impressive numbers of the project. Over 100,000 families benefited, a significant reduction in crime in the areas served, and a surprising increase in school performance of children who now had a stable home. Peter, with his aptitude for numbers, demonstrated how the sustainable business model had not only kept the company profitable, but also attracted a new profile of investors committed to social impact. Michael, in turn, presented the next big step, an ambitious project to revitalize degraded urban areas, transforming them into vibrant and self-sustaining communities. When the presentation ended, the auditorium erupted in applause. Journalists crowded, eager for more details, while investors animatedly discussed the new possibilities that were opening up. Amid the excitement, Richard found a moment to gather with his family in a quiet corner of the stage. "You were incredible," he said, hugging his children with pride. Helen, with tears in her eyes, added, "Who would have thought that that encounter in Santa Fe would bring us here?" Richard smiled, remembering that fateful day that changed the course of their lives. "It was the best mistake I ever made," he said, gently kissing Helen's forehead. At that moment, an aide approached, informing that the mayor of New York wanted to discuss a partnership to expand the project to the city's low-income neighborhoods. Before stepping away for the meeting, Richard looked at his family one last time. "This is just the beginning," he said, his eyes shining with determination and hope. As Richard walked towards the future, he knew that challenges would continue. There would be obstacles, resistance, and moments of doubt. But with the love of his family, the support of transformed communities, and the strength of a greater purpose, he was ready to face any adversity. The journey that began with a chance encounter on a street in Santa Fe had transformed into a life mission, not just for Richard, but for his entire family and for thousands of others who now had a place to call home. As the sun set over New York, casting a golden glow on the new communities dotting the urban landscape, Richard Montgomery felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had not only built houses, but helped build a better future, a future where dignity, opportunity, and hope were within everyone's reach. And so, with a full heart and his gaze fixed on the horizon, Richard knew that the true work of his life was just beginning. The dream of a world where everyone had a decent home to call their own was no longer just a dream. It was a revolution in motion, a revolution of compassion, innovation, and shared purpose. As Richard made his way to the meeting with the mayor, he reflected on how far he had come. The once ruthless businessman who cared only for profits had become a beacon of hope for countless families. But he knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. In the meeting room, Mayor Sarah Thompson greeted Richard warmly. "Mr. Montgomery, what you've accomplished in Santa Fe is nothing short of remarkable. We believe New York City could benefit immensely from a similar initiative." Richard nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Thank you, Mayor. I believe that every city, regardless of its size or complexity, can implement sustainable and affordable housing solutions. It's not just about building homes, it's about building communities." As they delved into discussions about potential sites and logistics, Richard found himself drawing on all the lessons he'd learned over the past 5 years. He spoke about the importance of community involvement, sustainable design, and the long-term economic benefits of social housing. "One thing we've learned," Richard explained, "is that this isn't just charity. It's a sustainable business model that benefits everyone, the residents, the community, and yes, even the investors." By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a preliminary plan to revitalize several struggling neighborhoods across New York City. As Richard left City Hall, he felt a familiar mix of excitement and trepidation. The scale of the project would be unlike anything they had attempted before. That evening, as he shared the news with his family over dinner, Richard could see the pride and excitement in their eyes. "Dad, this is huge!" Peter exclaimed, already pulling out his tablet to start running numbers. Michael, always the visionary, added, "Think of the artistic opportunities. We could involve local artists in each neighborhood to give each development its own unique character." Helen squeezed Richard's hand under the table. "You've come so far," she said softly. "We've come so far." As the family discussed ideas late into the night, Richard felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance not just at fatherhood, but at leaving a lasting positive mark on the world. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Richard split his time between New York and Santa Fe, overseeing the expansion of their projects while ensuring that the original communities continued to thrive. He made it a point to be home for dinner with his family at least 4 nights a week, no matter how hectic his schedule became. The New York project faced its share of challenges. Some developers and local business owners pushed back, fearing that affordable housing would decrease property values. Richard found himself once again in boardrooms and community meetings, passionately arguing for the long-term benefits of inclusive, mixed-income neighborhoods. It was during one particularly heated town hall meeting that Richard realized how much he had changed. As an angry resident shouted accusations about the project bringing undesirables into the neighborhood, Richard didn't respond with anger or dismissal as he might have in the past. Instead, he listened, acknowledged the residents' fears, and then calmly presented facts and personal stories that highlighted the positive impact of their projects. "I understand your concerns," Richard said, his voice steady. 5 years ago, I might have had the same fears, but let me tell you about Maria, a single mother who was able to provide stability for her children thanks to one of our homes. Or John, an elderly veteran who now has a safe, affordable place to live out his golden years. These aren't undesirables. They're our neighbors, our community members, people who deserve the same chances we've had. His words seemed to resonate with many in the audience, and by the end of the meeting, even some initial opponents were cautiously supportive of the project. As the first New York developments began to take shape, Richard made sure to involve his children in every step of the process. Michael's designs incorporated elements of each neighborhood's cultural heritage, while Peter's financial models ensured long-term sustainability. One crisp autumn morning, as Richard stood at the site of their first New York project, watching the framework of homes rise against the city skyline, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Helen, bundled up against the chill, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said, handing him a steaming cup. Richard took a sip, savoring the warmth. "You know," he said, gesturing at the construction site, "none of this would have been possible without you. That day in Santa Fe, you could have turned me away. You had every right to, but you gave me a chance to be better, to do better." Helen leaned into him, her eyes on the rising buildings. "We gave each other a chance," she corrected gently. "And look what we've built together, not just a family but a legacy." As they stood there, arm in arm, watching their vision take shape, Richard knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more cities to help, more lives to change. But with his family by his side and a clear purpose in his heart, he was ready for whatever the future might bring. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays catching on the windows of the partially built homes, each one a promise of a better tomorrow. And in that moment, Richard Montgomery, once driven by profit and now propelled by purpose, felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his true calling, not in building empires of wealth, but in building foundations of hope for countless families. As the day wore on, Richard and Helen made their way back to the office, where Michael and Peter were eagerly waiting to share their latest ideas. The Montgomery family, once fractured by absence and misunderstanding, was now united in a common goal: to change the world, one home at a time. And so the story of Richard Montgomery and his family continued to unfold, a testament to the power of second chances, the strength of family bonds, and the profound impact that can be made when compassion and business acumen come together in pursuit of a greater good. As the years passed, the Homes for All initiative expanded beyond New York, touching lives in cities across the country. Richard Montgomery, once known as a cutthroat businessman, became recognized as a pioneer in social entrepreneurship. But for Richard, the true measure of his success was not in awards or accolades, but in the smiles of families receiving keys to their new homes, in the thriving communities rising from once neglected neighborhoods, and in the pride he saw in his children's eyes as they carried forward the legacy he had begun. The journey that started with a chance encounter on a Santa Fe street had blossomed into a movement, a ripple effect of positive change that would continue long after Richard was gone. And as he looked towards the future, Richard knew that the best chapters of his life and the lives of countless others were still being written.